They called it the suicide turn, and they were right. If you got it wrong by the width of a fingernail, it killed you. The sea looked very far away, and then suddenly very close, flashing like spilled mercury under a Maltese sun that made everything hard-edged and unforgiving. A Spitfire Mark V, its wing roots dusted with the fine ochre sands of Qali airfield, hurtled a few feet above the chop, with 3 black-crossed Me-109s clamped to its tail like wolves' closing jaws. The radio crosstalk was a rasping hum, the Merlin's note a taut wire you could pluck. There was the smell of fuel, hot oil, burned cordite, baked into cockpit paint, and all of it slipping into a single, irreversible moment. No textbook told you to turn here. No instructor would sign off on it. In the mess, the older hands had laughed when he described it, the flick, the rudder kick, the full-blooded skid that made an airframe groan and made a human being trust the knife edge of a stall. Try that at 50 feet, one of them had grinned, and we'll be fishing you out of Grand Harbor by tea. The laughter wasn't cruel. It was the gallows humor of a garrison under siege, of pilots sleeping in limestone caves while the island shook under bombs, of men who had seen schemes and cleverness smudged out by the cold logic of physics and the finality of the sea. But this morning the logic belonged to him. In front, heat ripples shimmered. Behind, Messerschmitts bristled with confidence, their yellow prop spinners flashing in the sun. The pilots in their cockpits veterans of the Channel front and the Russian steppe, sent to Sicily and then across the straits to swat down Malta's defenders, to make a small piece of rock surrender by taking away its eyes. The lead 109 hung on, Predator steady. He could see it clearly in the small mirror on the Spitfire's canopy, saw the long, squared-off tail, the fluted radiators, the faint crease of wingtip slats about to creep out under load. He took a breath, not the first, but the last he would take before reaching for the one trick he trusted more than anything he had been taught. He remembered being told he would never need to skid a turn, that a turn was a gentle arc created by bank and lift, not a street fight forced by a boot and a wrist. He remembered standing on the sun-cracked apron at Qali, hands drawing an invisible line across the sky, while a sergeant rigger shook his head and said, "You can't do that in a spit. Not down there." He remembered seagulls flaring white against the surf, the way their bodies twisted with a flick that changed everything in an instant. He had spent hours mapping those motions, translating bird to airplane, sketching geometry in the air with the nose of a fighter. The island itself seemed to lean in, every balcony and bastion, every church spire and splintered stone wharf, the vast curve of the Grand Harbor beyond, the salt pans and the terraced fields. Malta had been bombed until there were hardly any adjectives left to describe it. People cooked in shelters. Bread was rationed, water carried in dented tins. Spitfires arrived on carriers and took off in sprints that felt like miracles, their Vokes filters choking them at low level, the paint on their leading edges sand-scoured to a dull, archaic sheen. A handful of pilots' boys, men, hungry, sun-browned, eyes bleached pale by the Mediterranean glare, climbed into thin armor and flew, day after day, spiraling up to meet raids, snapping onto enemy formations, diving on tattered bombers, and tangling with the fighters that covered them. He was new, and he was not, because he came with something in him that no syllabus could annotate. In Canada, he had practiced deflection shooting on thrown washers and gulls over lake water stories people told with a skirl of outrage and admiration. He had trained himself to think not of where a target was, but where it would be, not to chase a tail, but to cut an invisible ribbon in space. Malta gave him the canvas. Malta gave him enemies who believed in energy and height, in boom and zoom tactics honed by doctrine. His own belief was narrower, hotter, that if you could make a man follow you past sense, past training, you could drag him far enough into your own physics that he would make your mistake, not his. They called it suicide because no one wanted to name what it really was. A refusal to be hunted at the one place the hunter felt safest. There is a prejudice baked into all flying: stay high, stay fast, let gravity pay you back, never pay it in advance. But down here, just above the glossy cards of the sea, with spray marking the slipstream and gulls exploding upwards like scraps of torn paper, he would pay up front. He would trade altitude for position, drag for surprise, energy for geometry, and bet his life that the Spitfire's broad wing and quick roll could carry him through a maneuver no engineer had signed off on. The nose dipped a fraction, the throttle eased and then jammed forward. A boot came down hard, aileron followed, and the world did what it always does when a human being pushes a machine past the polite margins of its design. It shouted no, and then it agreed. The Spitfire did not so much turn as change its mind. It didn't carve a fair arc. It snapped, twisted, skidded, all of its weight shifting like a dancer's over a line thin as fishing wire. The Merlin coughed on a gulp of prop-washed air, and then roared as the wings bit. In the mirror, a human face in a 109 brightened with surprise, and then alarm. The lead Messerschmitt overshot, then hauled hard, flaps flickering as the pilot tried to tighten, to hold the turn he had not expected to have to make. The slats busted open with a metallic clap. The 109's nose bobbled. Its wings stumbled on the edge of a stall. That was the moment he had wagered on, the moment he had lived to see, just long enough to bring the sight ring a black and yellow oval and make a tiny, barbaric peace with the physics that had always silenced the laughter. The burst was short. He did not spray. He placed 24 rounds at most, each one launched with the certainty of a finger flicking a bead on a rosary. Orange strikes stitched the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. Something let go. Oil plumed like black silk. The curved nerve of a prop blade turned to a blur, then to a scythe, then to nothing at all, and the 109, its line spoiled, fell away, a bird with a broken neck, stunned and angry at gravity. There was no time to watch it hit. The second 109, eager, expert, committed, tried to do what the first could not try to stay in, to follow the Spitfire through the madness, to make it mutual suicide. The sea raced. The turn hedged into a vertical scissor, the kind only two pilots who had burned up their fear could perform. For an instant, they were side by side, two pieces of wartime craft knifing the air inches apart, pilots craning, guns maw silent, while each machine found a new purchase on the sky. He felt the control column shake. He eased and applied opposite rudder with the tenderness of a surgeon. He had learned by himself, against orders, rehearsing in empty, sun-speckled afternoon skies, exactly how far to go and no further. The other man, believing machine and muscle would answer with the same fidelity, overcooked it, added a degree too much elevator, a slice too much bank. The 109 did what 109s did when persuaded too hard near the water. It committed to a gentle, dreadful half-roll, and then, with a long, patient inevitability, went down, not in a dramatic plunge, but in a spiral as plain as a screw boring through wood, its pilot fighting the weight of centrifugal force with everything he had, everything he was, and losing ground to the indifferent sea. In the tower at Qali, men grabbed the edges of their desks. On a limestone escarpment, beyond a terraced field enclosing thin, heroic vines, a farmer looked up from his donkey's harness and shaded his eyes. Down in Valletta, near the bond-chipped line of a fountain that used to grace a polished square, a boy heard the sound echo in the vaulted roof of his shelter and imagined silver fish looking up at a sky full of fire. They called it the suicide turn. They had laughed because laughter was easier than conceding the idea. Now, with the third 109 strapped tight and furious to his wake, he changed everything once again. Before that morning, before the bird edge of effort had notched itself into every moving part, he had been just another pilot with a comma of a mouth, and eyes fixed on a point no one else could see. The new man on Malta usually arrived with some myth attached, the Rhodesian who flew like a dancer, the 19-year-old with a widow's peak and an appetite for mischief, the Canadian who shot at gulls, who set his guns to converge at a range so short you could smell gasoline on the wind from your target. Some of it was true, some of it lies that hardened into a kind of rough magic. War is an editor, vicious and precise. It deletes what is unhelpful and underlines what it needs. He had come out of that long chain of airfields and instructors, of medical checks and forms stapled by bored clerks. He'd learned to handle a tiger moth as if he were swinging on a gate, to coax a Harvard trainer into a perfect circuit in a sky that had no enemies in it. He had learned math in the air, not on paper, how bullets take time to arrive, how a target moving across your nose is not just a temptation to follow, but a problem to be solved. Even as a boy, he had a restlessness that people found either charming or intolerable. He wanted to master one thing no one could teach him: how to make the air accept the shape he proposed. England had been one thing, the Channel another. Then came the journey across the iron-blue Mediterranean, a cargo hold set close against your head, the stink of bodies and fuel, the ocean like hammered metal. Malta was a promised name spoken in a dozen accents. Men told you it was like a stone gun swallowing shells, that you could walk down Republic Street and count the days by the craters. They told you that the air in an air raid takes on the quality of thick cloth, that it presses on you from every direction. At Qali, they'd built pens from limestone blocks and sandbags. Aircraft were a currency more precious than gold, each one a portion of the island's chance to go on existing. Each Spitfire had a story stitched to its skin made from parts from Castle Bromwich, crossed the Atlantic in a ship that dodged torpedoes, assembled by Maltese hands with knuckles skinned by rubble. The Vokes filter on the nose killed speed, but saved engines from dust. Cloyson enamel squadron badges were faded to a faint hint. Fabric gun patches on the wings were new each morning, neat squares of pinkish dope ready to tell ground crew whether a pilot had opened fire and how long he'd stayed at it. The groundmen, fitters, riggers, armorers, whose names never made papers, worked until there were cracks in their thumbs deep enough to hold oil. They'd sleep on their backs between the wheels, listening to the Spitfire tick as the hot metal contracted, dreaming they were inside a machine that panted like a tired animal. The Messerschmitt was a different kind of beauty, all purposeful angles and compact power. It came across in 3s and 4s, often with the emblem of JG-53, the ace of spades, on its fuselage, sometimes with nose spinners painted a fierce yellow. Its pilots were no amateurs, nor were they villains. They were, to a man, calm in that very particular German way. Heirs to a schooling that taught not just the how, but the why of fighting in the air. The 109 slats automatic, clever, popped out under load and kept a wing honest at high angles of attack. Its Daimler Benz engine let the pilot push -G without fuel interruption. Early Merlins coughed under -G, starved by their float carburetors. The 109 loved the vertical plane, loved to climb away after a slash and run, loved to dive back in when the terms were right. It was a machine that rewarded patience and punished showiness. On Malta, the terms were seldom right for anyone. The island was too small to build height if a raid came right on top of you. The bombers from Sicily Ru 88s, SM-79s, Qali arrived with their fighter escorts in layers like geological strata. If you were already up, you were in the game, carving a path through contrails and flak bursts that seemed to be laid out just to frame your mistakes. If you were on the ground when the sirens went, you started your run with the rolls of sand and stone blurring past under your wings, and the thought that perhaps this time the runway itself would lift in a sheet wave like a carpet pulled by a giant hand. In the mess, they drank tea made from water that had a history to it and coffee when someone had scrounged it in. They ate rations that would have tired a saint's patience, and they laughed because the alternative was to mark the days with tally marks that looked too much like the lines in a ledger. They told stories because stories true, false, lightly dusted with each made in armor you could wear under your flying gear. It was in a tangle of such stories that the term gathered its name. The suicide term. Not a term in any air fighting development unit memo. Not something you would see on a chalkboard where a squadron leader, pointer in hand, traced the perfect geometry of pursuit and lead. It was the kind of trick a man invents when his life depends on having a move no one else knows. He didn't invent it in one afternoon. He chipped at it like a sculptor chipping at a boulder. He went up alone in fat shades of late day, when the enemy was home, and the island sky belonged to Maltese clouds. He pushed the Spitfire through low-altitude banks that made discipline feel like heresy. He learned the way the Vokes filter changed the engine's voice at the edge of a flick. He learned that if you went left too abruptly, the engine torque would either make the movement feel like a gift or punish you with a gruff shudder that meant you were at the lip of a spin. He learned to watch the telltales on the canopy frame, the tiny beads of oil tremble on rivet heads. He learned his own wrists, their strength and their limits, and his ankles too. The rudder was poetry written with feet. You will hear in pilot talk a contempt for low altitude. It's where mistakes are final. But Malta forced habits to change. The island's only space was between the water and the wreckage of the last dogfight. There he invented a private geometry. He called it nothing. Other men named it for him, because people name what they fear and admire. He told a pair of pilots how it went, half serious in the mess, hands drawing lines, explaining how you can take a hard bank, kick with rudder, unload just enough to slide the nose, and turn inside a pursuer at a height where everyone agrees you shouldn't even be trying to outdraw a pistol. They laughed, the real laughter of affection and defense. And he let them laugh, because the only certainty in that room was this: if he needed it, he would use it. There was precedent for mad brilliance. Adolf Malin had written 10 rules that were sober and sound. Get the sun behind you. Never fly straight and level for more than 30 seconds. In the combat area, always try to keep a full view of the sky. And he would add his own 11th. learn the man you're fighting. He knew from 8 or 9 engagements that had ended with everyone angry and no one dead that the German pilots hunting him were brave and tractable, and, sometimes, a fraction too proud of the laws they believed governed combat. He could use that. Surprising facts accumulate in the margins of this story like metal shavings under a lathe. Spitfires arrived so hot from their long ferry run on carriers that they sometimes had to be hidden before the enemy could count them. Ground crew mixed high-octane fuel with a caution born of many burned throats. Maltese civilians built decoy aircraft out of timber and canvas that glinted just enough to be strafed by frustrated fighters. The island's airfields were not grass-green and romantic, but chalky, dusty, hard-packed tan. Pilots adjusted their gun convergence. Some left it at the standard 400 yards. Some tightened it to 200. Some, like him, preferred 150, even 120, because he believed in the intimacy of a fight where you could count rivets. The Messerschmitt slats, happy to pop out, could sometimes, under the hardest yaw and roll, give a pilot a surprise nudge that he would run out of altitude to correct. All of that knowledge sat like small stones in his pockets. On the day in question, the heat was already a rumor at dawn. The scrambled bell went. He ran in the peculiar way men do when they carry their own hearts in their hands. Ground crew dragged away chocks with the energy of men who have known the taste of failure and vowed not to sip it again. The prop bit. The nose surged. Sand leaped back from the wheels. The airfield spilled away behind him. Above the bluish haze he could see contrail threads pointing the way to company. If you'd stood near the dispersal hut that morning, you might have heard someone, smoke angled down from a lip, murmur again. Suicide turn, like the name of a drink that has too much in it, like a dare. If you'd asked, they would have told you that every chance on Malta had a dose of suicide in it. But they'd have said it with a hand on his shoulder as he went by, because a squadron is more than a file and a roll. It is the set of glances men share in the few seconds between hearing a siren and starting their engines. He climbed into a war that met him with the simple courtesy of being exactly what it had been the day before. A hell with rules, and an exception, and men inside it choosing which to be. The Me-109s came down like coins dropped through water, fast and glinting, becoming larger with a steadiness that felt almost domestic, like watching someone walk down a hallway. The sky above Malta often had that quality. You could see your killers coming, see their speed, feel the timing of their dive, as if they were promising to arrive at a dinner, not a murder. He put his Spitfire across their path, not in defiance of physics, but to put himself at a place where the geometry worked for him. You do not chase a Messerschmitt down unless you plan to be surprised. He knew that. The 109 could play the vertical game better, but you could persuade one to commit, persuade a pilot that his advantage was so clean and so obvious that it would be a sin not to take it. He let them tuck in, gave them a morsel of straight and level flight, just the chewing gum in the trap. The island spread under his wings like an old map valletta, like a folded hand. The grand harbor like a trumpet bell. Ships like nails set into blue wood. He dipped towards the line where light goes purple near noon, where the wet glints are too bright to look at. The first 109 was too sure. Its pilot had the discipline of a metronome. He held the Spitfire in a steady sight picture, closed the range, fought the wind's tendency to bump the nose, flicked the safety off his cannon, heard the altered tone of a gun cam start to whir. In the mirror of the Spitfire's canopy, his face fixated not a sneer, not a smile. Something like concentration so pure it erases expression. And then the English or Canadian, or Maltese, or everyone did the one thing doctrine does not expect. He turned with a change so abrupt it was vulgar. The flick was neither luck nor madness. It was anatomy. The Spitfire's wing, broad and elliptical, distributed lift like a hand spreads force through fingers. The 109's narrower wing, with its slats, could also do savage turns, but with different feelings across the instruments and chassis. He kicked rudder, loaded the ailerons opposite, unloaded the stick a hair, felt the seat bite. The 109's pilot answered as he had been taught. Bank, pull, make the circle small and the oncoming picture large. But the 109's slats snapped with an audible clank, changing the flow over the wing in a manner of pilot. Reading his machine like Braille, consents but cannot translate quickly into a correction when the sea is a glass plate only 2 heartbeats away. It was one of those moments where decades of engineering, politics, and training compress into a half-second of sensation. A tiny bobble you might correct at 2,000 feet becomes a hand that smacks your shoulder at 50. The 109 skittered, its nose pitched a fraction, and he put 2 20mm shells and a lick of 303-inch stitch into the engine line where he knew, because he had sketched it in pencil 100 times to aim. The splinter of oil screen and a single fat splash of glycol came up over the canopy of the Messerschmitt like a black flower opening. The 109's pilot rolled instinctively to dump the nose and keep air over the wing. He was no fool. He took the hit like a gentleman takes a cuff and made the only decision a professional can make within a second of disappointment. He broke away and asked the machine to take him home. Oil smeared the windscreen like paint. He threw the canopy open, put his face into clean air, held his left boot heavy because the prop torque had gone asymmetrical. He would not make land. He knew it. He had a family story that would end not in a farmhouse back in Bavaria, but in a cushion of brine that would close over him with a flexibility more final than earth. The second one, that man. This is not a story that sneers at enemy dead. He was brave, and he believed in himself. He tried to coil inside the Spitfire's turn. He took the spray and turned it into a curtain, hiding behind it and thinking himself unseen. He lost a slice of speed. He bled it for position, a rightful gamble. But the Spitfire counters with surprise, and if you surprise a man and then ask him for more, he will often pay double. The Spit's nose slashed through his canopy's imagination of where it had to be, and he tried to overshoot. Honest and hard, and the weight did what the weight will do when a machine is not given room. It induced a torque roll. He unloaded, he did. You can see it in your mind's eye, the hands moving with grace born of hundreds of hours. But the sea is greedy. He left a white scrawl on the surface of the water, like someone drawing a question mark, and then pressing too hard on the pen. The third took it personally. He held on, smart enough to widen his circle, to give himself that quarter beat of time no one else had bought. He stayed back, refusing to be goaded into overcommitment. He had read his opponent's rhythm. He was one of those pilots good enough not to dislike his enemy. He had watched his friend fall and kept the part of his mind that wants to make a mistake slow. Here is where the turn becomes more than a trick. The skidding 90-degree change is an opening bid, not a whole hand. He had to layer it, change the axe of the fight, swap the horizontal scissor for a vertical, then refuse to stay in one plane for more than the 3 seconds it takes to become a predictable animal. He took the spit up just enough, rolled inverted, let the nose drop, and then this is where years of compulsion to get the calculations exactly precise matter rolled back level the instant the nose sliced the horizon at the angle he wanted. The 109 committed to the vertical a half tick late. In the half, a man dies. He flattened, turned his head, saw metal and eye and intent in his gun sight, and fired a burst short enough to be a thought, long enough to be a sentence. You might think this is where it ends, but a pilot with 1,000 decisions as ballast does not accept the first result. The 109 took a hit. Coolant slicked one wing, changing its lift enough that the aircraft began to bias left. The pilot, smart and stubborn, did not accept the sea's invitation. He traded altitude for the distance he needed to try to find a field of air he could land in, but there were no fields in front of him, only water. He pulled up. The Merlin of the Spitfire hauled. Its pilot wanted to finish it, because nothing is uglier than an enemy returning to fight another day in a sky like this, where every returning enemy lengthens the siege. He lined up again, the sight again a circle, the enemy aircraft again a coin falling through the center. He pressed the button, and nothing changed, because in between the previous moment and this one, a single piece of grit had lodged itself in his mind. He saw, as clear as a photograph, the way most of his rounds had impacted, left of center line. He corrected little more than the width of a fingernail, and the next few shells wrote his name across the 109's radiator and the base of its prop. The Messer pitched, wagged, tried to answer with a turn that cut his speed so wide you could almost hear the pilot say, "Scheiss," with surprise and contempt at fate. He tried to bail. You could see the canopy begin to crack back, but the slipstream grabbed it and slammed it closed again. He was a very good pilot, and he might have even been an ace, and this is not hagiography. Men of records hunted here. JG-53 did not loan Malta its second team. But even aces are susceptible to their machine's moods at sea level. He went into a shallow spiral that tightened like a noose. The sea held out its mirror and asked a rhetorical question with a final, absolute grammar. 3 black-crossed aircraft made arcs of foam on the water that day. One fell outright, one danced and lost, one lost enough blood to bleed out into a salt grave. People who watched from rooftops and bastions told the tale with their hands, describing circles and falls, making little sounds that had the brittle joy of survival in them. The men in the dispersal asked for details quietly, because if you speak too loudly of these moments, they evaporate. You want to know what it felt like, perhaps. How his hands were when he taxied back. How long the engine ticked after he cut it. What his face did in the moment after his canopy slid back. He did not whoop. That came later, sometimes. He sat for an extra second, not because anything in him was fragile, but because men often take a small inventory when an event of that size has moved through their bodies. He found in that second that he was angry at something he couldn't have put a name to, maybe at the sky for making such transactions necessary, maybe at the sea for being so efficient a ledger. He climbed down. A rigger slapped his shoulder. An armorer looked at the gun patches and smiled, a tight thing. The squadron leader did not make a speech. No one does when the day is not over. The laughter, later, at the edge of the mess, had nothing to do with mockery now. It was elastic, relieved. And in some corner, someone would still call it a suicide turn, but the word would have changed shape. It was no longer a joke. It was a prayer, you say, because the alternative is silence. In a war, you live in layers of discovery, because the people around you are making new knowledge, and it changes what the day looks like. He wrote notes in a hand that was precise and careless at once. He described where he had fired and how long. He listed the state of his engine, the mentions of stuttering under -G. He corrected in the margin a detail that a British flight commander had gotten wrong out of habit. He had no quarrel with authority. He had a quarrel with what he called laziness in the mind. If a thing could be done because a machine and a man believed in each other, then there was no reason not to do it, except that it condensed the odds too sharply for comfort. What people forget is this: the innovation that makes headlines is often erected on a scaffold of small, ordinary courage. Ground crew changed his gun belts in minutes, hands blackened, nails broken. An armorer's fraternity took pride in sending their pilot up with guns that would fire the one time he needed them to most. Fitters listened to their engines with a stethoscope of fingertips. Malta's pilots and their machines formed a single organism, tired and exquisite. There were other mornings. There were days when the suicide turn stayed sheathed, when circumstances didn't allow the luxury of a trick, when his world was all line abreast runs at bombers, firing into the smeared ovals of Ru 88 fuselages and stepping aside from the gentle, awful arcs their parts described when you broke a wing root. There were afternoons when a Me-109 took him in a flash and left him pushing hard into the straps and thanking the old gods and the new for the fact that Spitfires, even then, could absorb punishment like a man who smiles through an insult, only to remember every word of it later. He was not a superhero. He was a virtuoso in a specific murderous craft. He had defects. He had an arrogance that rubbed some men raw and a self-discipline that made others feel small. He chose to be alone in the air when he could. He did not like to fly as a pack animal. That in itself hung like a question over every mess table. Are you a wolf, or a fox, or a shepherd? He would have said he was a hunter of moments. The best of the other pilots admired him. A few disliked him. None failed to mark what he accomplished. If he felt the island's gratitude, it came at him in sudden waves. A Maltese woman once stuck a sprig of basil in his buttonhole. A child shouted "Spitfire" from a window. Priests who had watched too many funerals lifted their eyes when Spitfires came back and whispered something too fast to hear. The governor of Malta would later pin medals on lapels and name streets. But on this day, and the days around it, gratitude was water fetched from the Baraka Gardens the day after a raid had knocked out the pipes again, or a cigarette slid across a table with a wink, or a plate of something that might have been meat, shared between three of them, while the mess orderly pretended not to see, because he too had eyes. There is a temptation in narration to bound the story tight, but the air will not be bound. That same week, a pilot as good as any lost in a collision at 18,000 feet, a random, hateful intersection. Another took a bullet in the radio set that would have gone through his spine, and laughed about it for exactly 7 minutes, and then went quiet and stared at his tea. A Maltese family packed to leave their house, and then returned to it because there was nowhere else to go, and found on the kitchen table a bomb that had not gone off, and decided to make coffee anyway around it, because they were a people raised to do what is before you. German pilots, in their messes across the water, told their own stories. They talked about Spitfires that turned like swans, about a place where the enemy seemed to have no business still being. They drank schnapps and tapped cigarette ash, and highlighted the tactical missteps their staffel made with a cold severity that matched any English analysis. They were not devils. They were professionals in another uniform, with a different set of myths about why they fought, and the same human tenderness towards the men who fell out of the sky in front of them. One of them, perhaps the one who had tried to follow him through the turn, and kissed the surface of the Mediterranean with lethal gentleness, had a letter in his kit from a girl signed Dean Lies, and a photograph of a dog with a foolish face. That detail will not unmake what happened. It is there, because reality does not care about your posture in a narrative. The laughter that had first named the turn faded into a kind of respect that has no jokes, only the energy of survival. At a chalkboard, the squadron leader would trace not a perfect textbook fight, but the line that had saved a man's life, and he would say, reluctantly, "If you can do it like that, only if you can do it like that, you can get away with murder down there." He would glance at a sergeant pilot who could not, whose hands were steadier, whose mind was organized but not protean, and he would say, "But you know, don't, climb, survive, fight the fight you've trained to fight. War is not a democracy. It is a terrain of gifts and deficits, of men who can and men who shouldn't, and the obligation between them. Surprising facts do not abate. When you fly that low, salt sits on your airplane as if it wants to claim it even when it is on land. After long wave-top fights, crews had to wash the skins of their aircraft like they were alive, to keep corrosion from walking the rivet lines like a disease. Spitfires on Malta were painted as much by weather as by brush. Sand scoured them into pale, almost ghostly versions of home markings. Pilots learned to read not just the enemy's machine, but his mood. How a man held a turn said everything about the life he had lived to that point. There were pilots you could smell in the air, their impatience as clear as the exhaust. There were pilots so calm, you would have thought they were asleep until their guns scribed reality. When he went back up later that week, after a hot meal that put meat in his arms and a nap that had the shape of death without the permanence, he did not plan to make a theater of any trick. He did what training and instinct cut into him had him do. He flew as if the enemy had a mind, and he wanted to live in it rent-free. This is the actual core of his method. He saw what the other man saw, felt what he would feel, and then put in front of him, at the most inconvenient time, a request to make a decision his training had not covered. This is the trick that beggars all tricks. Empathy weaponized. If you can feel the point at which your opponent will commit to foolishness, and you can place that point on the very lip of a space he cannot survive in, you can win without bullets. He did not always. There were days when he came down pale with the thought of how narrowly he had not. He once put his Spitfire into a spin at such a height that even the sea held its breath to see if he would find reverse, and he did, because his hands knew something his fear could not cancel. But in a conflict that means to simplify human beings into shooters and targets, he complicated it. He insisted on the personhood of pilots across the way as a means to unmake them. It is a dark gift, and all the more necessary for that. Reports came in from the other side of the island. A transport hit, a warehouse burning in Marsa, a fuel dump smoking like a kill, a family lighting a stove again. The turning of fighters into spirals of foam on the sea felt like a miracle with a ledger. Attached those shells into that engine, equaled these tins of meat arriving next month, and this nervous, beautiful crew failing to find their target today and aiming left and missing St. Elmo by 2 streets. No pilot carries the weight of that arithmetic in full. But some part of him, when he looked down at the neat crescents on the water, felt the subtraction. The title of this story is an argument. They laughed at his suicide turn. They were right to do so, as far as they went. Many maneuvers baptized with bravado are simply ways to shrink a life. But then it sent 3 Me-109 aces spiraling into the sea. Perhaps they were aces. Perhaps they were not. The men on Malta did not have access to German scoreboards. They had only eyes in the measure of a hand on a shoulder, and the knowledge that those Me-109s were flown like violins by men who knew their strings. And the turn took them, and the laughter stopped. And something new for a time lived in the small gap between daring and skill. Later, when the siege lifted and cargo came into the grand harbor like a blessing, when the island smelled a little less of dust and burned things, when Spitfires came and went with the rhythm of something that felt again like a schedule, men would try to give all of it names. They would hang medals on lapels and write citations and organize memories into stories they could tell children without making them cry. The problem with good names is that they presume to have captured complexity. The worst problem with bad names is that they make a lie sound tidy. The suicide turn sits between those poles. It is, in some part, a boast, and in another, a warning, and in another, still, a prayer to whatever gods accept offerings of sweat and risk. He lived on, as pilots who survive notoriety do, in a ring of affection and irritation and myth. He did not ask to be the main character of Malta, but there is a magnetism in extreme skill that attracts both praise and a kind of contempt that is only jealousy in costume. He left the island later, and he flew in other skies where other names hung like laundry. He died in peacetime in a way that felt to some like an affront, and to others like inevitability. History dotes on ends. It should, perhaps, care more about middles. What matters is this. On a day when there were only bad options, he made one that bent toward survival. He took a thing others called madness and made of it a discipline, a sort of discipline that art requires. He learned the precise weight of rudder at 50 feet, and he taught his machine to love it. He wrestled with the truth that at the bottom of all war skills, there is a coldness, a decision to take from another person all the tomorrows they are carrying around, and he did not disguise that decision as virtue. But he also made room in his skill for the kind of humanity that notices details, how the light prints itself on water, how a gull rotates its shoulder into the wind, and allows them to enter the tight machinery of a dogfight like contraband. The larger story of Malta's defense would have been the same without him, and simultaneously impossibly different. No single pilot wins a siege. No single trick outthinks a doctrine by itself. But multiply a man's refusal to be ruled by other men's limits by 1,000, and you begin to draw the silhouette of endurance. Multiply a dozen ground crew who refuse to send an aircraft up with a lazy gun by 100 mornings, and you begin to see how the calculus changes. Add in the grandmothers who break ration bread with a grace that certain bishops would envy. The children who point to a chalked outline of a Spitfire on a classroom slate and vow to know that shape by heart. The priest who blesses oil drums. The officer who refuses an easy transfer. The governor who refuses to apologize for asking so much of his island. And you begin to hear the music. The 3 spirals on the sea are not the entire score. They are, however, a motif you can hum. They demonstrate a principle that extends beyond the sky. Courage is not only the blunt insistence on standing up. Sometimes it is the cleverness to step sideways. The men who laughed at the turn were wise. They knew risk and loved their friends. The man who did the turn was wise in another way. He knew that at the edge of what we call impossible, there is a space where the impatient and the exact meet and shake hands. If there is a call to action in this, it is not to try a turn at 50 feet. It is to locate in your own life the place where your world has told you not to dare, because the manual does not cover it, and to ask yourself if you can, by craft and practice and a pinch of mad faith, make a space there that belongs to you. It is to honor the men and women who, in wars past and wars now, and in the quiet wars of ordinary days, hold on to discipline like a lifeline while allowing themselves one dangerous, beautiful idea that changes evenly spaced outcomes into asymmetrical ones. We remember Malta because it is small and stubborn, and because in it we can see the outline of necessity. We remember planes with wings like blades and men who flew them, not because their stories are clean, but because they are precise. We remember laughter that became respect. We remember the sunlight on water and on the metal of machines and on faces smeared with oil. We remember a turn that looked like a dare and became a sentence, and then, finally, a paragraph in a chapter we continue to write together every time we resist the temptation to quit. A myth will do what myths do. It will grow extra layers. People will argue about dates and names and squadron numbers and the exact kind of Spitfire, about whether the 109s were aces or simply brave flyers having an unlucky day. Let them. Let the story also hold the separate truth that one man's invention in a sky of strict rules saved him and harmed others and shortened a siege by exactly the unmeasurable increment by which morale tilts towards a day less hard. Let it hold the image of 3 spirals drawn on water with fire, disappearing almost at once and yet visible if you close your eyes forever. Walk outside this film in your mind and look up. The sky is empty today, perhaps, or not. Somewhere a gull is still demonstrating physics, turning with that offhand little flick that set a boy on a path to a morning where laughter became applause. Somewhere a machine ticks as it cools, and a hand brushes dust from a leading edge, and a pilot, unknown, adjusts his sight a hair to the right, and finds, in the correction, the difference between legend and loss.